If you could travel back in time and walk through the dusty alleys of Nazareth or Capernaum in the 1st century, the first thing you would notice would not be religious fervor or preachings in the synagogues. It would be the deafening silence of half of the houses. For every 2 children born in the Galilee of Jesus' time, only 1 had the biological privilege of reaching 18 years of age. Childhood in that time was not a period of play and innocence. It was a gauntlet of disease, hunger, and a brutal struggle for existence that modern archaeology is only beginning to reveal in all its rawness. While sacred texts focus on the spiritual message, the soil of the Holy Land guards a much darker narrative, that to be a child at that time was to be constantly with 1 foot in the grave. In this documentary, we are going to unearth the secrets kept for 2,000 years under the sands of Judea. We will understand why life expectancy was so low and how the environment in which Jesus grew up was, in fact, a survival field where infant death was as common as the sunrise. This is not a study of theology, but an archaeological and scientific investigation into the fragility of human life at the height of the Roman Empire. The first piece of this macabre puzzle is found in the cemeteries excavated throughout the Galilee region. When archaeologists analyze the burial patterns of the 1st century, they find something disturbing. In many locations, infant graves outnumber those of adults. For science, this points to a mortality rate that today we would consider a catastrophic global humanitarian crisis. But for a peasant family of that time, this was just everyday reality. The enemy was not just the Roman sword or the oppression of tax collectors, but a series of invisible killers that lurked inside every home. Life in a village like Nazareth was defined by proximity. Houses were small, made of stone and mud, with minimal ventilation and scarce light. But the real danger came from the absolute lack of sanitation. There were no sewage systems, no water treatment, and the concept of hygiene as we understand it today was non-existent. The disposal of human and animal waste occurred just a few meters from where bread was prepared. In paleopathology analyses, the science that studies diseases in ancient human remains, the bones of Galilee's children reveal a story of biological warfare. We find evidence of chronic parasitic infections that drained nutrients from small bodies before they could even grow. A simple outbreak of diarrhea from contaminated water, something we solve today with home rehydration salts, was capable of decimating 30% of a village's children in just 1 week. Dehydration was a swift and merciless execution. Furthermore, osteological analyses show the constant presence of so-called Harris lines. Imagine the bone as a tree trunk that records the climate. These lines are internal scars that prove that child's growth was interrupted several times by periods of severe malnutrition or extremely high fevers. The average child in Galilee lived in a state of permanent biological stress. Weaning was another critical and dangerous moment. While the baby received breast milk, they were protected by the mother's antibodies. But around 2 years of age, when the child began to depend on water from local cisterns and a diet based almost exclusively on coarse cereals, the immune system collapsed. It is at this point that excavations show the highest peak of deaths. The transition to the adult diet was, in practice, a test of endurance that half of the population failed to overcome. Walking through the streets of an ancient village was to encounter a child population, marked by wounds that did not heal, eyes affected by bacterial infections, and stunted bodies. The archaeology of survival forces us to abandon the romantic view of the past to face the truth. Life was short, painful, and extremely uncertain. This invisible mortality shaped not only the demographics, but the very psychology of families. Imagine the emotional impact of losing 3 or 4 children before any of them reached adolescence. How could a mother or father emotionally invest in a being whose permanence in the world was so unlikely? This constant pressure created cultural behaviors that to our modern sensibilities seem inhuman, but were actually psychological shields against unbearable suffering. One of these behaviors involved the child's very identity. The question that arises when analyzing these data is, how does a society manage to prosper when death is the rule for the youngest? The answer lies in a shocking cultural mechanism that transformed babies into almost invisible beings until they proved their strength. Why did many parents avoid giving names to their children in the first months or even years of life? And how did this preventive dehumanization affect the care and life chances of these little ones? This is what we will discover next as we explore the dark weight of the nameless children. To the sensibility of the 21st century, the loss of a newborn is an overwhelming tragedy, an event that paralyzes families and demands months or years of mourning. However, to understand the mind of an inhabitant of Galilee or Judea in the first century, we need to perform a painful exercise in distancing. In that world, mourning was an emotional luxury that few could afford to sustain repeatedly. With an infant mortality rate hovering around 50%, the social fabric developed a kind of cultural anesthesia. Archaeology and historical sociology reveal that at that time, a child was not seen as a full member of humanity from the first breath. They were, in fact, a candidate for human being. This concept of gradual humanity is one of the most shocking discoveries for those who study antiquity. In many cultures surrounding the world of Jesus, especially under the influence of the Roman Empire, a baby was not considered part of the family until the patriarch, the paterfamilias, formally decided to accept them. If the child was born with a deformity, if the family was in extreme poverty, or if it was simply an unwanted daughter, they could be exposed. The abandonment of newborns in trash heaps or on the outskirts of cities was a legal and common practice in the pagan world. Although the Jewish people were widely known for rejecting infanticide and valuing life from birth due to religious precepts, the pressure of biological reality imposed a similar emotional barrier. The most visible mark of this barrier was the delay in assigning an identity. In many rural villages, a child's name was not guaranteed at the moment of birth. Although Jewish tradition prescribed circumcision and naming of boys on the 8th day, documentary archaeology suggests that for the general community, deep social recognition took much longer. There is evidence that in various regions of the ancient Mediterranean, babies who died before completing 1 year of life did not even receive formal funeral rituals. They were buried under the floors of houses or in common graves, without tombstones, without names, and without recorded memories. For parents of the time, investing a name and an identity in a being who had a 50% chance of disappearing in 1 week was an emotional risk too high. This perception of disposable childhood was not born from a lack of love, but from an instinct for psychological survival. Death was so omnipresent that excessive attachment was seen as a weakness that could destroy the family's productive structure. If a mother paralyzed her activities every time she lost a child in the first months of life, the whole family would starve. Thus, culture shaped the human heart to wait. The baby was breastfed, cared for, and protected, but total effective investment often only occurred when the child demonstrated a will to live. That is, when they survived the first and most lethal waves of infections and malnutrition. This reality created an abyss between the spiritual value and the economic value of the child. In the ancient world, and specifically in the agrarian context of Galilee, a person was defined by their ability to contribute to the group's survival. A small child was, technically, a drain on resources. They consumed calories, demanded constant attention from an adult who could be in the field, and offered no immediate return in terms of productivity. Therefore, childhood was seen as a stage of imperfection that needed to be overcome as quickly as possible. The modern idea of preserving the innocence of the child simply did not exist. The goal was to transform that small being into a functional worker in the shortest time biology allowed. Archaeology shows us that this pragmatism reached levels we would consider brutal today. When analyzing child remains at sites like Nazareth and Sepphoris, we realize there was no difference in health treatment between a child and a valuable pack animal. Often, the animal received more nutritional attention because it was vital for the following year's harvest. The child was a long-term asset in a world that lived in the short term. This preventive dehumanization served as a shield. If the child died before becoming a worker, the loss was seen more as a failed investment and private grief than as the end of a citizen of the community. However, this cultural hardness hid a deep tension. The same parents who avoided early naming were the ones who desperately sought amulets, prayers, and protection rituals in the excavations of ancient houses. We find small objects, blue glass beads, and rudimentary inscriptions that served to ward off evil from cradles. The fear of death was fought with the silence of the name, but also with the superstition of protection. It was a precarious balance between the need not to become attached and the desperate desire for that specific child to be the only one to survive. As the child grew and finally received their official place at the table and in the family genealogy, biological danger decreased slightly, but a new and heavy challenge appeared on the horizon. For the children who survived the phase of anonymity, the prize was not a childhood of play, but immediate entry into a world of fatigue and adult responsibility. The transition was so rapid that for many historians, adolescence simply did not exist in the first century. But what was the daily life like in practice for a child who managed to cross the barrier of 5 years of age? What does the archaeology of labor reveal to us about the small hands that help sustain the economy of Judea? In the next segment, we will explore the abrupt end of innocence and understand how child labor was not an option, but the only gear that kept villages like Nazareth standing. We will discover that for a boy like Jesus, carpentry was not a light apprenticeship, but a daily struggle against physical exhaustion and bone deformation. If you could observe the daily life of a village in Galilee 2,000 years ago, the greatest discrepancy in relation to our world today would not be technology, but the total absence of the concept of childhood. For us, the child is a being who must be protected from the hardships of the adult world. For the inhabitant of the first century, the child was a tool for survival that needed to be sharpened as soon as possible. As soon as a little Galilean's feet gained firmness and their hands could hold a tool, play gave way to duty. From the age of 5 or 6, the time of discovery ended abruptly. The child ceased to be a drain on resources to become a vital economic asset. The archaeology of labor in Judea shows us that villages like Nazareth were not bucolic communities of contemplation, but nuclei of heavy subsistence. The Roman tax system, added to local religious tithes, drained about 30 to 40% of everything produced. In a scenario of such narrow margins, a family could not afford to support useless mouths. Every member of the house, from the oldest to the youngest, needed to produce. Child labor was not seen as exploitation, but as the only barrier between the family and collective starvation. For boys, fate was mapped by the father's craft. We often hear of Jesus as the carpenter's son, but modern archaeology suggests that the Greek term tekton was much broader and more brutal than the image of a furniture craftsman. A tekton was a general builder, a man who worked with wood, yes, but primarily with heavy stone in construction sites. Imagine a boy of only 8 or 9 years old carrying baskets of rubble, mixing mortar, or pulling ropes to raise limestone blocks under the scorching sun of Galilee. Excavations in the neighboring city of Sepphoris, which was in full expansion during Jesus' youth, reveal the type of superhuman physical effort that was demanded of these early apprentices. The analysis of mortal remains of young people from this period reveals the scars of this effort. We find evidence of premature arthritis in the spinal columns of individuals who had barely reached 18 years of age. There are clear signs of vertebral compression and deformations in the shoulders and knees, the results of years of carrying loads far beyond the capacity of a growing body. What we call today a growth spurt occurred at that time under the weight of bundles of firewood, 20-liter water jars or heavy iron tools. Biological development was literally shaped by fatigue. Girls did not have a less exhaustive fate. Theirs was the management of domestic survival, a task that required grueling physical strength from an early age. Grinding grains to make daily bread was not a light activity. It required hours crouching over heavy grinding stones, a repetitive motion that caused permanent damage to the joints of the wrists and fingers. Furthermore, it fell to the children to carry out the daily task of fetching water. In villages where the spring was hundreds of meters away and on inclined plains, a 7-year-old child could spend half the day transporting weight, climbing up and down slopes under temperatures that frequently exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. This early entry into the world of work had a direct consequence on education. Although there was basic religious teaching for boys in the local synagogues, the focus was oral memorization. Full literacy was a luxury. The priority was learning to read the land, the cycle of rains, and the resistance of wood or stone. Knowledge was practical and transmitted through sweat. The school for a child in Nazareth was the wheat field, the oil press, or the construction site. The mind was trained for repetition and endurance, not for innovation or leisure. The psychological impact of this life of early servitude is difficult to measure. But archaeology gives us clues about human resilience. Even in this scenario of extreme hardship, children were still children. However, their value to the community was measured by their utility. A son who could not work due to illness or disability was a sentence of poverty for the entire lineage. This explains why, in historical and archaeological accounts, the healing of a sick child was not just an act of emotional compassion, but a restoration of an economic pillar of the family. Living in the Galilee of the 1st century was inhabiting a world where the human body was spent as fuel. For survivors of childhood, the reward was an adult life marked by chronic pain and accelerated aging. But in the midst of this gear of labor and pain, what does the earth reveal to us about the humanity of these children? Did they have time to be little? Did they leave traces of their existence beyond the deformations in their bones? The answer lies in the silent objects that archaeologists pull from the earth. Small artifacts that tell us a story of affection in the midst of chaos. In the next segment, we will look at what was found in the excavations, the rudimentary toys and the small bone boxes that paint the final and moving picture of life and death in villages like Nazareth. We will discover that even in a world that treated them as tools, children left traces of an innocence that insisted on not dying. Despite the statistical hardness and the exhaustive work routine, archaeology offers us a moving glimpse that beneath the layers of pragmatism and survival, a vibrant humanity pulsed. When archaeologists excavate the floors of the ancient houses of Nazareth, Capernaum, and Jerusalem, they do not find only stone tools or utilitarian ceramic remains. They find what remains of the moments of respite of that besieged childhood. They are small objects, often made of coarse clay or carved bone, that prove that even in a world that demanded the child be a precocious adult, the instinct to play was impossible to suppress entirely. One of the most common finds at 1st century sites are the pieces known as astragali. These were small bones from the legs of sheep or goats, which children used in games of skill and luck, functioning as the ancestors of our modern dice. Finding these objects among domestic debris is a silent reminder that, between one shift of work in the field and the next, those little survivors sought entertainment in the scraps of what nature offered. In addition to astragali, small terracotta animal miniatures, miniature toy wheels, and clay rattles with small stones inside were discovered, designed to soothe babies facing the fevers we have already discussed. However, the contrast between life and death is omnipresent in biblical archaeology. Perhaps the most impactful record of the brevity of life in that era are the infant ossuaries. In the 1st century, the Jewish burial custom involved 2 stages. First, the body was placed in a niche inside a family cave. After 1 year, when only the bones remained, these were collected and deposited in limestone boxes called ossuaries. Walking through the necropolises of Jerusalem or the Galilee, archaeologists find tiny boxes, some little more than 30 centimeters long. Many of these small ossuaries are plain, without decorations, and most sadly, without inscriptions. While adult ossuaries frequently bear the name and lineage of the deceased, those of children tend to be anonymous, reinforcing the theory that full identity was a privilege earned through survival. But occasionally, the earth reveals something that breaks this coldness. In some excavations, small objects were found, deposited inside these bone boxes. A colored glass bead, a small amulet, or even a favorite toy. These gestures, preserved by the dust of 2,000 years, reveal the desperate grief of parents who, despite all the emotional protection of the culture, could not avoid deep love for those who departed too soon. The biological analysis of these bones kept in ossuaries provides the final diagnosis of that era. By using technologies such as mass spectrometry and isotope analysis, we discover that malnutrition was not an isolated event, but a chronic condition. Enamel hypoplasia, permanent marks on the teeth that form when the body interrupts growth to fight an infection or extreme hunger, is present in nearly 100% of the child remains found. This means that even children belonging to families with some possessions were not immune. Food insecurity and sanitary instability were democratic in their cruelty. Archaeology also shows us the impact of deficiency diseases. Skeletons have been found with clear signs of rickets caused by a lack of vitamin D and scurvy, the result of a vitamin C deficiency. This may seem contradictory in a land described as flowing with milk and honey, but the economic reality of the first century was one of resource export. The best wheat, the best oil, and the best fruits of Galilee were frequently confiscated by Roman tax collectors or by the priestly elite of Jerusalem, leaving for peasant families and their children only what remained, a nutrient-poor diet rich in deprivation. Looking at a clay toy found next to a child's ossuary is to face the paradox of life in the time of Jesus. It is to understand that every adult we hear mentioned in the Gospels, every fisherman, every Pharisee, every follower, was technically a survivor of a biological and social war that eliminated half of their brothers and sisters. This awareness of imminent death was not a philosophical thought. It was a constant sensory perception. The smell of illness and the sound of mourning were part of the landscape as much as the olive trees and the Sea of Galilee. This brutal reality forces us to a fundamental question. How did this omnipresence of infant mortality influence the message of the one who grew up in Nazareth? If Jesus lived in a culture that often marginalized or dehumanized the child as a form of emotional protection, what does it mean when he breaks this pattern? In the final segment, we will connect the dots between archaeological science and the cultural revolution provoked by his message. We will understand how the valuing of children was, perhaps, one of the most subversive and necessary proposals for a society that was accustomed to burying its little ones in silence and without a name. To understand the true magnitude of the message that emerged from the hills of Galilee in the first century, we must now cross-reference biological archaeology data with the history of mentalities. As we have seen, the child in antiquity was a peripheral being, an uncertain promise that society protected through emotional distancing and social invisibility. However, it is exactly in this scenario of half-life and forced anonymity that one of the deepest cultural ruptures in human history arises. When we look at the historical records of the period, we realize that the valuing of childhood was not a natural evolution of medicine or economics, but a deliberate subversion of a system that considered little ones as second-class beings. Imagine the impact of a voice that, in the midst of a culture that buried 50% of its children without a name, declared that theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For an inhabitant of Nazareth who saw the child as an unfinished work tool or a high biological risk investment, this statement was not just poetic, it was revolutionary and, for many, incomprehensible. Social archaeology shows us that the hierarchy of the first century placed the adult man, provider, and citizen at the absolute top. Women, slaves, and children occupied the base of the pyramid, often in indistinguishable categories of social value. By placing a child at the center of his teaching, Jesus was, in practice, forcing his audience to face what they spent their lives trying to ignore: the fragility and intrinsic dignity of the human being before their economic utility. This shift in perspective has deep roots in the life experience of Galilee itself. The historical Jesus did not grow up in a theological vacuum. He grew up seeing his contemporaries being taken by sudden fevers and intestinal infections. He walked the same streets where infant ossuaries were carved in silence. The sensitivity he showed toward the little ones was a direct response to a society that had become anesthetized by constant loss. While the Roman Empire saw the excess of children as a problem of population management, and the economic elite saw them as cheap labor, the new message proposed that the child was the model of purity and receptiveness. Excavations in Capernaum, specifically in the residential areas surrounding the famous House of Peter, reveal how communities began to reorganize under these new ideals. We notice gradually a change in how families dealt with loss and memory. The early Christian tradition, influenced by this differentiated view, was one of the first to openly condemn the exposure and abandonment of babies, a practice that, as we discussed, was the acceptable standard in the Greco-Roman world. Where the empire saw a life without value because it was unproductive, the new ethics saw a sacred life because it was an image of the divine. This transition was not just spiritual, it had real physical and social consequences. By elevating the child's status, the community began to dedicate more resources to their preservation. Caring for the orphan and the widow, the two weakest links in the ancient survival chain, became the central pillar of a new social structure. Documentary archaeology from Alexandria and Antioch shows that the first communities that adopted this vision began to show slightly better survival rates, not by a medical miracle, but by a community support network that guaranteed mothers had something to eat and that children were not abandoned at the first sign of illness. Science tells us that half of those children died, but history tells us that those who survived were transformed by this new way of seeing the world. The child ceased to be a candidate for human to become the standard of spiritual excellence. This was the greatest blow against the cultural anesthesia of the first century. However, as much as the mentality was changing, the land was still hard and the invisible killers continued to lurk. What remained, after all, of that generation of survivors? How does the understanding of this brutal scenario alter the way we read historical and biblical accounts today? In our final block, we will close this archaeological investigation with a reflection on the legacy of these little Galileans and why understanding the pain of that childhood is fundamental to our understanding of the strength of any message of redemption that emerged from that dust. As we end our journey through the dusty alleys of Galilee and the silent necropolises of Judea, a truth imposes itself over any myth or artistic representation. Childhood in the time of Jesus was not a garden of innocence, but a forge of extreme resistance. Archaeology does not lie. Bones do not keep ideological secrets. What they tell us is the story of a generation that lived under the constant shadow of an invisible executioner, where every breath was a victory over infection, hunger, and social abandonment. Understanding that 50% of children died before maturity is not just a statistical fact. It is the key to our understanding the real weight of every word, every gesture, and every transformation occurring at that turning point in human history. The men and women who changed the course of the world in the first century were, first and foremost, the rare survivors of an implacable biological sieve. They carried in their bodies the marks of malnutrition, in their spines the weight of early labor, and in their minds the trauma of having seen half of their peers disappear into the dust without even having their names engraved on a stone. It was in this fertile soil of pain and precariousness that a new seed of human dignity was planted, a vision that dared to challenge the logic of economic utility and proposed that a child's life, however brief and fragile it might be, possessed an infinite and sacred value. Today, when we look at the excavations in Nazareth or Capernaum, we do not see just ruins of cold stone. We see the trail of a desperate struggle for existence. We see the marks of small hands that ground the wheat, the clay rattles that tried to silence the cry of fever, and the tiny ossuaries that kept the mourning of a civilization. The archaeology of survival teaches us that the greatest miracle of that era was not just what was recorded in books, but the fact that, against all biological and social odds, humanity managed to flourish and rewrite the rules of affection in a world that trained it for indifference. Understanding the past in its rawness allows us to value the present with more clarity. Those nameless children whose bones today serve as the basis for the study of paleopathology were the silent foundation upon which Western culture built its concept of care and protection for children. They were not just victims of their time, they were the witnesses of an era that learned, in the hardest way possible, that the true strength of a society is not measured by the power of its legions, but by how it protects its most vulnerable members. The story of the Holy Land in the first century is, ultimately, the story of life insisting on sprouting between the stones. It is the story of how extreme fragility gave way to a cultural force that still resonates 2,000 years later. As we look at what the Earth revealed in this documentary, we are forced to admit that historical reality is much deeper, darker, and at the same time, much more moving than any fiction could create. Biblical archaeology continues to unearth facts that challenge our perception of the past. Of all that we explored today, from the anonymous ossuaries to the heavy labor in childhood, which archaeological discovery surprised you most? Do you believe that the hardness of that life was what made the message of compassion so powerful at that time? Write your opinion in the comments below. If you value this type of immersive documentary content and want to continue exploring the secrets of the ancient world through science and real history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I am your narrator, and this was one more deep dive into the roots of our history. Until the next documentary.